computer. Exactly. Perfect. Okay, good evening, everybody. And my name is Marco Pellegrini. I am the secretary of the Association of Italian Researchers in Japan. Welcome to our second AIRJ talk. This is a format that we have started after the foundation of the association, basically to discuss about social sciences, to involve basically the Italian researchers that of our association that are in particular belonging to the hard sciences, basically STEM, engineering. And thanks to Giorgio, who is my co-chair today, we are inviting in particular Italian researchers. Today, Professor Zappa is the second one. Last time it was Andrea De Antoni, but this is not limiting to the Italian one. So if you are interested in this activity, in this event, and you have any idea on how to support these activities, please get in contact with us, and we are happy to open this to other contributions. But I talk too much, so I leave the floor to my co-chair, Professor Colombo. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. It's a great pleasure to be here today again with this AIRJ talk series. And again, like the purpose of these talks is basically to discuss themes related to Japanese academic humanities and social sciences, especially but not exclusively aimed at researchers in Japan. Many researchers, they live and work in Japan, but they have no specific background in Japanese studies, so they have a lot of curiosity and interest towards Japanese society, history, culture. And we decided to launch this series by asking academics, scholars, researchers who study these issues as their profession to deliver these compact, approachable talks open to everybody. So today is my great pleasure to introduce a friend and a colleague, Dr. Marco Zappa. Marco is assistant professor of Japanese studies at Ca' Foscari University, Venice, and his research revolved around the history of Japan's external relations and development assistance, particularly in continental Southeast Asia. In this regard, he investigates human resource development programs and development assistance-related special policies, such as urban transformations and urban technology exports. Furthermore, he's exploring territorialization strategies and special economic zones. Besides Japan, he has worked and conducted research in China, Germany, Vietnam, and South Korea. Today, we asked Marco Zappa to give a presentation about the legacy of the atomic bomb in Japan, basically, and he kindly accepted our invitation. So without further ado, Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giorgio, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Marco Pellegrini, as well, for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be able to speak to such a distinguished audience today. If I may share the screen, I hope that everything works right. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Perfectly, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. So today's talk, as Giorgio was mentioning in his presentation, is dedicated to a very important issue in Japanese contemporary history, and of course in Japanese international relations as well, because it's a foundational issue of post-war Japan, and something that is being currently addressed by Japanese administrations, Japanese cabinets, and even Japanese politicians especially from the majority party, the Liberal Democratic Party, as something that has to be overcome and has to be thoroughly revised, because external threats are increasing, and Japan especially Japanese policymakers and high-level diplomats, are increasingly in a situation where external threats are perceived and represented as a direct threat to national security and to national survival. I will briefly, I will attempt to give you an outline of what has been the debate around and of course the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's bombings in 1945, and how Japan has, especially how Japanese governments have treated the nuclear issue in terms of especially military nuclear in their dealings with the United States and their their Asian neighbors. Let me start from here. A lonely Japanese soldier walks on a piece of wasteland in Hiroshima in September 1945. The soil he treads on looks bare and muddy, and all around him, as far as the camera lens can see, the landscape is leveled. Scattered, unidentified debris, branches, they might be wooden frames, metal plates, lie around him. In the distance, the profile of what seem ominous naked trees stand against the background of a group of hills covered in mist. The soldier is apparently the only living human being caught by the camera in a scene of utter gloom and desolation. This landscape is the product of the bombing that hit the city of Hiroshima in August 1945. And this picture has been taken only a few weeks later. The hit by a US uranium-based yet experimental weapon, a preliminary test, was only conducted in mid-July in New Mexico, which vaporized the city and around a third of its population in a few instants. 3 days later, the bombing of August 6, 1945, another destructive nuclear blast hit the southern port city of Nagasaki. How have these two events influenced and are continuing influencing the Japanese government's approach to nuclear weapons? Is this legacy still alive against the backdrop of growing perceived threats posed by Asian neighbors? And since February 2022, of Russia's bold attempt at changing its international status as well? I might add to this point that formally Japan and Russia are still at war because they never signed a peace treaty after 1945, after the end of World War II. Despite the spectacular display of military and technology might, these Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings represented, these two bombardments came at the height of a US counteroffensive on Japanese-controlled territories in the Pacific and on Japanese mainland, let's say, on the Japanese main islands, on Japanese national soil. Begun in June 1944 with the air raids over Kitakyushu, US air raids and fire bombings killed hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed between 60 and 90% of residences in major cities such as Osaka, Tokyo, and Nagoya, driving millions out of their homes. And these are data that I'm taking directly from the book you were seeing in the slide, Embracing Defeat by John Dower, which is literally, I don't think I'm overstating this, but it's a kind of a masterpiece in the literature on Japanese post-war history, and especially on the direct aftermath of the conflict. But going back to my speech, furthermore, these two, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, are causing a dramatic food crisis in the country. Despite all these facts, and despite especially that Japan's allies by May 45 had already surrendered for months, Japanese military leaders encouraged their soldiers and the populace to resist and die honorably as jewel shatterers, or more succinctly in Japanese, they were invited to commit gyokusai. In February 1944, for example, Prime Minister Tojo Hideki had already called the populace to be prepared to die in an infamous appeal known as Ichioku Gyokusai. That means 100 million honorable deaths. This is something very recurrent also in the reconstructions and in the histories of Japan, and especially of Japanese of the war in the southern fronts, for example, in the Pacific, and so on and so forth. Anyways, between 1944 and 1945, suicide attacks of entire Japanese armies divisions were instructed subsequently from the Aleutians to Tarawa, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, from Manila to Okinawa, to attack their enemies, inflicting suicide attacks, inflicting at times severe damages to the opponents, with tens of thousands of deaths, several which were, of course, also civilians. After June 1945, Okinawa fell under control of US troops, and Japanese coastal waters were filled with naval mines, impeding sea access to the archipelago. The following months, during the Potsdam Conference, where the leaders of the US, USSR, and Great Britain met to discuss the terms of Japanese surrender, US President Harry Truman received the news that the test of the first atomic bomb was successful and gave order to make preparations for the use of this new weapon on Japan by early August. The first nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima at 8:15, August 6. The second one at 11:02 on August 9 on Nagasaki. While in Tokyo, a Supreme War Council was meeting to discuss possible terms of the surrender to be forwarded to the Allied powers. Despite the devastating impacts of the two blasts, which wiped out the two entire cities and hundreds of thousands of people in the flesh, army leaders kept denying the possibility that their nation could capitulate, and opposed Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro and Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori's plan to accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender. Instead, War Minister Anami, Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda, and Army Chief of Staff Umezu pushed to continue fighting to improve Japanese position vis-a-vis the Allies' requests. Allegedly, it was Emperor Hirohito's intervention in favor of accepting the Allied powers' conditions that set the diplomatic negotiations in motion. A few days after the second atomic explosion, the emperor himself spoke to the nation via radio in a radio broadcast. It was the first time, actually, that the emperor directly addressed its nation, its population, scrapping a taboo, in fact, and announcing that Japan was accepting the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration. In addition, Hirohito acknowledged the great hardships that lay ahead on the nation's path to reconstruction and to endure the endurable and suffering what is unsufferable, and vowing also to be always with his loyal subjects, preserving and defending the national polity based on the unity between the sovereign and his subjects, which in Japanese is called a concept that in Japanese is rendered as kokutai, merging the two characters of kuni, nation, state, and tai, karada, body. He also regretted having failed the empire's East Asian allies who had cooperated with Japan towards the emancipation of East Asia, and expressed his condolences to those officers and men who have fallen in the fields of battle, and those who died at their posts of duty, or those, quote unquote, who met with untimely death and all their bereaved families, end of quote. Interestingly, the word defeat, haisen in Japanese, was not contemplated in the emperor's address. Ambiguous expressions such as the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, or the general trends of the world have all turned, and again, quote unquote, the general trends of the world have all turned against their interests, end of quote, were used instead to indicate Japanese military debacle. Neither are there references to specific and precise references to the two nuclear blasts. So in the emperor script, actually, you don't find Genshi Bakudan or Genbaku or anything that might relate to the lexical sphere of nuclear and nuclear bombs. These two bombs were referred just as new and most cruel bomb, end of quote, that might cause the total extinction of human civilization, according to Emperor Hirohito in his address in mid-August 1945. As revealed by Dower in the book I just showed you, even though a report in the New Yorker magazine in August 1946 had shed light on the consequences of the atomic blasts and especially on Hiroshima survivors, on several Hiroshima survivors, talking about the atomic bomb in the aftermath of World War II, and especially under US occupation, was de facto prohibited by US authorities, at least until 1949. A memoir by Nagai Takashi, who was a survivor of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima, finally emerged right that year in 1949 as a first installment of what would become a sort of genre, a sort of literary genre of atomic bomb memoirs, atomic bomb autobiographies, and so on and so forth. Even scientific writing, and this might be very interesting for some of you, even scientific writing about the effects of the blasts on the human bodies was hindered, basically, was prohibited, was censored. Only in 1952, when the occupation ended and 7 years after the actual bombings happened, the Japanese public was allowed to see photographic materials of regarding the bombings themselves, and the removal of such events. The conclusion is basically that the removal of such events from public conscience is also linked to the stigmatization and discrimination against the survivors of the bombings, called in Japanese hibakusha. And this approach, this attitude towards survivors of the atomic bombings became pretty widespread at the war's end. Again, as Dower notes, defeat and quote unquote, defeat, victimization, an overwhelming sense of powerlessness in the face of undreamed of weapons of destruction soon coalesced to become the basis of a new kind of anti-military nationalism. End of quote. In other words, quote unquote, in its peculiar way, the bomb became simultaneously a warning about future wars and a beacon illuminating a path to future Japanese empowerment, end of quote. Such an approach of, let's say, pacifist, passive anti-military nationalism, as Dower defines it, has become embedded since the end of World War II in Japanese government's approach to defense and in its leaders' strive for a global and regional guiding role for their nation. On top of this, this attitude has attracted a wide popular consensus, which only recently has started to basically fade out. Faced with emerging or perceived regional threats, again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in recent years, Japanese political leaders have attempted at rehabilitating the image of nuclear weapons as instruments of security rather than instruments of death or immense suffering. As all of you probably know, after the end, and I mentioned already this, after the end of World War II, Japan was put under US direct military government, direct military occupation, and basically the US directed Japan's policy making and influenced it in a very heavy way. The nation's figurehead policymakers, the nation's figurehead governments were urged by the occupiers to draft a new constitution that, and I quote, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, forever renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. End of quote. These words are contained can be read in Article 9 of Japan's post-war constitution. Despite periodical reinterpretations leading to rules and regulations which have sometimes contrasted in principle with the article itself, the Japanese government since the end of World War II have generally maintained their commitments and have generally renounced the use of force. So again, building a new image for their country, a new image for the nations, particularly vis-a-vis its Asian neighbors, which were the object of Japanese military and imperial aggression during the 1930s, especially during the 1930s and 1940s. But again, Japan's colonial enterprise began way earlier at the end of the 19th century with the annexation of Taiwan after the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894-1895, and then annexating and including in its imperial sphere also the Korean Peninsula after the war against Russia in 1905-1906. The pacifist nature of post-war Japan was reaffirmed, in addition to Article 9 that I just read to you, was reaffirmed in the mid-1960s under the government, under the executive of Prime Minister Sato Eisaku, which you see smiling, well, laughing actually in the picture here. Sato announced the adoption and the official adoption in 1967. He announced the official adoption of the 3 non-nuclear principles, or Hikaku Sangensoku, of not possessing, not producing, and not permitting the introduction of nuclear weapons into Japan. Sato's vow has been reiterated by subsequent Japanese cabinets until recent years, and it has basically been incorporated in the official Japanese policies and in Japanese diplomatic papers since then. Based on Sato's decision, in 1976, Japan ratified the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, and the instrument of ratification reads as follows. and I quote, Japan, as the only nation to have suffered atomic bombings, declares anew to the world its fundamental policy of forsaking nuclear armament. And at the same time, and I quote again, to take concrete, Japan pledged to take concrete nuclear disarmament measures, such as the reduction of nuclear weapons and the realization of a comprehensive nuclear test ban. Based on these observations, one might reckon that being the only country in the world having been hit by 2 nuclear bombs, Japan has completely renounced to a nuclear capacity already by the 1970s. However, this is only partially true. Japan's post-war security alliance with the US has in fact jeopardized from the very beginning, actually from the very beginning of US occupation in Japan, the consistency of the non-nuclear principles, of the non-nuclear policies carried out by Japan. As revealed, for example, by a 2010 study promoted by the then Democratic Party of Japan-led government, Japanese prime ministers and high-level diplomats have acquiesced in US warships and jets introducing nuclear weapons in Japan since 1959. Actually, on this topic, there has been a heavily political and dramatic debate in recent years, right on the concept of what introducing actually means, if it means just deploy nuclear weapons on Japanese soil or not. However, it has been demonstrated that, for example, nuclear weapon, especially warships, US warships loaded with nuclear weapons have made port calls, have entered Japanese ports since the early 1950s, especially after right in concomitance basically with the Korean War, and then more dramatically in the 1960s with the beginning of the Vietnam War. However, nuclear weapons were apparently, except with the exception of Okinawa, have not been deployed on Japanese territories as you know, physically, actually. However, the Okinawa exception is still relevant. Relevant in this debate. Nevertheless, such instances. I hope you can still hear me because I'm seeing messages.
Yeah, your connection is not.
My connection is unstable.
Yeah, your connection is not perfect, but so far we can follow you. So
okay, please.
Yeah, no worries.
Tell me if you cannot hear me or something wrong with my voice or my speech, my talk.
So far is acceptable. No worries. We only had a couple of minutes of not perfect audio, but still was audible and clear. So no worries.
I'm very sorry for this problem.
No problem.
But again, please again in the Q&A session, please flag something that wasn't clear in my talk. Back to the talk. So the instances of acquiescing in US warships and warplanes introducing nuclear weapons in Japan, as I was mentioning, was in fact not covered by mechanisms of prior consultation between the US and Japan, which applied only to cases of direct deployment of nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. However, in an era characterized by US-USSR competition, especially in Northern Pacific, but generally also in Asia Pacific as a whole, competition, direct military US intervention, and against the background of also direct military US intervention in Asia. Given the Japan-US Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, which was signed in 1951, the introduction, at least, of nuclear weapons in the Japanese archipelago contributed, could be considered as a natural consequence of the international, of the global arrangement of that era. And moreover, it contributed to enhancing Japanese security under the US umbrella, nuclear umbrella. Japan's perception of a threat from a neighboring country were particularly highlighted again during Sato's term as nation's prime minister from 1964 to 1972. Against the backdrop, for example, of China's nuclear tests in 1964, Tokyo sought a clear commitment from the US toward nuclear deterrence. Dealing with US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in January 1965, the then Japanese Prime Minister stated that, and I quote, "Japan is adamantly against possession and use of nuclear weapons. Even though it is not impossible for Japan to produce nuclear weapons, we will not take the same position as French President Charles de Gaulle." Also, please be careful about any comment on nuclear introduction because the matter is stipulated by the US-Japan Security Treaty. However, in the case of a war, the situation would be totally different. We expect the United States to take an immediate retaliation by using nuclear weapons. End of quote. And this is taken from a study by Ota. With President Lyndon Johnson, again, 2 years later, Sato reiterated, and I quote again, "At my last visit to the US, President made a pledge to protect Japan from any attack. Considering China has developed nuclear weapons since then, I would like to expect that the same commitment you made last time will be applicable for any nuclear attack against our nation." End of quote. Hence, Sato was agreed US protection by then President Lyndon Johnson and secured the reversion of Okinawa, where between 1954 and 1972, more than 1,300 nuclear weapons were installed. This is again an estimate, data I'm taking from Otto's study. At the same time, government officials in the Sato years commissioned 3 secret studies on the need for Japan to go fully nuclear in an independent and autonomous manner. However, these 3 studies, according to Ota, revealed the lack of a strong political case for nuclear rearmament by Japan. And of course, this could have also had dramatic consequences in terms of popular unrest, of support, of the support rate to the Japanese LDP-led government. What is more interesting, however, in this case, in this situation that evolved and developed in the second half of the 1960s, is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a secret policy paper that admitted the need for Tokyo to maintain an economic and technical potentials for nuclear weapon production, while paying attention not to being restricted from doing so by anyone, thereby investing in nuclear full cycle technologies. That is to say, using the byproduct, I guess, of civilian nuclear plants for a potential nuclear military use. confirming this, let's say, secret guideline of the foreign ministry in Tokyo, in 1988, the US Reagan administration even gave an advance consent to Japan for US nuclear fuel reprocessing. The situation changed quite a bit after the end of the Cold War. That is to say, after the end of US-USSR confrontations and competition, and also after the withdrawal of the US, of a partial withdrawal of US military presence, at least directly involved on the field, boots on the ground, from the Asian theaters, especially from Vietnam. But anyways, after the end of the Cold War, again, several port calls by US nuclear submarines, for example, have been recorded in Japan, in Japanese ports and in Japanese territorial waters. And more recently, under Abe administration, from the early 2010s, US nuclear and traditional deterrence over Japan has been reaffirmed quite a few times, even partially under the Obama administration, but more clearly under Trump. More recent events, however, have again contributed to changing the strategic landscape surrounding Japan, and especially again the perception of security threats coming from, just to mention a few, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, coming from China, which was already in the mindset of Sato Eisaku in the 1960s, and from February 2022, of course, from Russia. The Russian aggression to Ukraine, for example, and Moscow's threats to use nuclear weapons in case of a direct attack or direct threat to its national sovereignty, and again, combined with North Koreans' repeated launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles towards the Sea of Japan, have contributed to the reopening of a domestic debate in Japan around going full in on the nuclear option, or to put it in another way, renounce to the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the legacy of being the only country in the world being bombed by two nuclear weapons. In February this year, for example, late Prime Minister Abe proposed a nuclear sharing agreement between Japan and the US, thereby bypassing previous agreements on the introduction of nuclear weapons, basically a secret agreement between the two governments, before the study of 2010 revealed that it was there and it was in place and it was also used many times. And late Prime Minister Abe in February 2022, in the aftermath of the Russian aggression to this year's Russian invasion of Ukraine, invited his fellow party members, the Liberal Democratic Party, which has a solid majority again today in the Japanese parliament and holds control of the government, and also he invited cabinet members to consider the enhancement of the country's deterrence capabilities, while avoiding taboos when national security is concerned. So Abe urged his fellow party member and Prime Minister Kishida Fumio, who is currently Prime Minister of Japan, to to overcome, and again in a more sensitive and in a more dramatic way, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Abe's provocations, however, were rebuked by Prime Minister Kishida, and coincidentally, who is coincidentally actually a Hiroshima-born politician, and who has repeatedly vowed, both domestically and in international occasions, especially more recently in the latest UN General Assembly, to work for, and I quote, a world without nuclear weapons, end of quote. Nevertheless, Abe's idea, and this is my hypothesis, will stay and will influence maybe not Kishida, but many of his cabinet members, or at least several of his more conservative and more right-wing leaning members of cabinet, and also LDP members. In fact, Kishida will probably preside over the historic increase of Japan's defense spending to the quota of 2% of its gross national product. And this increase in defense spending will probably be used to acquire ballistic systems, ensuring counter-strike capabilities, and possibly, this is only an hypothesis, however, and probably the fruit of some leak of some news leak from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and from the Ministry of Defense, possibly also preemptive strike capabilities, which will basically allow Japan to act preemptively against a perceived threat, most notably from North Korea. So Japan might acquire the capabilities to attack North Korea before North Korea launches an ICBM. And I will move to my concluding remarks. I guess I'm on time, right, Giorgio?
Yes, there is plenty of time.
Okay. And so I will leave the floor, then I will leave some more time for Q&A, for discussions, and for of course the doubts and questions of the audience. My conclusion is that in against the backdrop and based on what I tried to outline in my presentation, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's bombings is in the process of being revised, at least, in the name of national security, against the narrative constructions, so to speak, of threats, of eminent threats to Japan's national security and national survival. Whether or not Japan will pursue an independent military nuclear strategy, it's still a matter of debate, of course. But the reinterpretations and all the reinterpretation again, and the attempt to revise also Article 9 of the Constitution are proof or evidence of this process. The country, in other words, is facing both domestic and external pressures to normalize its defense posture in preparation mostly for future conflicts that might involve the Asia Pacific and might actually spread to the entire region and involve directly both Japan and its number one ally, the United States. Whoever will overcome long-standing and anti-nuclear policies in the Japanese political arena, of course, will have, anyways, a hard time drafting new policies and vouching for the understanding of the domestic public opinion, but more significantly of Asian neighbors, governments, and diplomatic at all levels. For hardline conservatives, it will, if this process succeeds, for hardline conservatives, it will probably be a victory over a sense of entrapment in old school and old style political legacies and historical legacies that have made Japan in what has been so far. So an anti-nuclear, anti-militaristic, responsible international power. For others, especially in Japan, those who oppose remilitarization and the adoption of specific military nuclear policies, instead, the normalization in this sense of Japan against perceived threat will be just the end of a fascinating exception. And this was my conclusion. So I very much look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marco, for your presentation. Very clear and informative. So, of course, I would have many questions and comments as a law scholar. Constitutional reform and the interpretation of Article 9 is something I'm very interested in, but I would like to leave the word. So if there is any question from the audience, I would appreciate if you could use your raise hand function so that we have an orderly discussion. Anybody is welcome to join. Thank you very much.
Let me in advance thank Osamu Hayakawa for his comment, and thank you for for flagging that. Yeah, I meant Nagasaki. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Okay, I see the raised hand of Alessandro Centonza. Alessandro, please.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Perfect.
Yes.
So I was, thank you very much for the presentation. Wonderful, actually. But I was in particular interested in the latest part about the preventive attack, the eventual possible and hopefully never happen, but the preventive attack of Japan against North Korea because of the threat of rockets, as we well know. My big concern, and the question is, do you think would be really possible, even 1% possibility? Do you think it exists? Because let's take in consideration the reality of fact, G8 Thai never had any experience in real war. Okay, not just the soldiers, but also the elite. And second, how can be this taken in consideration by the population? There is decades that they've been considered as by the world and by themselves as the nation of peace. Okay, we refuse the war. We are against the war. How can a possible preventive attack against North Korea can be even discussed before being accepted, even discussed by the Japanese people and politicians? So these two aspects make me really in big doubt that this is even a chance. But as you said, is probably is not 0% chance. So what is your opinion about this possible situation?
Thank you very much, Alessandro, right?
Yes, exactly.
For the question. I guess it's a possibility that has been that is under consideration, that is in consideration, under scrutiny, of course. I guess also within the Liberal Democratic Party, but it's definitely conceived, and I actually tried to show you how there are historical evidence of this ongoing debate within the Liberal Democratic Party since the 1960s. I guess it will be very difficult because the Liberal Democratic Party itself has also liberals within it. and the decision-making process is long and can be also torn with difficulties and with other issues in the process of actually decision making. So I don't think this is going to be real and to be actual, you know, the preemptive strike capability in the near future, let's say. But maybe we might consider that, for example, currently we have a liberal, we have a Prime Minister, Kishida Fumio, coming from the liberal area of the LDP. He's been very cautious. He has rebuked Abe's ideas of nuclear sharing and enhancing Japanese deterrence with with an actual deployment of nuclear weapons in cooperation with the US allies, saying that the constitutions and the non-nuclear principles are the main instrument, not recognizing that capability of deploying nuclear weapons on Japanese soil, even though they're deployed by mostly the US ally. So he opposed to that kind of mindset and thinking in terms of security and diplomacy. But leaderships within the Liberal Democratic Party might shift. The balance might change, maybe soon. We cannot really make predictions about this. And so once it changes and once more conservative, more right-wing leaning politicians are brought into power, they might have more room for actual change. And the increase of the defense spending to acquire new equipment, enabling new military, new defense capabilities, will probably set something in motion, right? So I was reading yesterday on the newspapers that it is predicted that the Japanese government defense spending will reach the 2% of the GDP, of its national GDP, by 2027. So we might expect something, you know, maybe in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. But we cannot really make predictions based on the fact that, you know, the international situation is evolving very, very quickly. And of course, the North Korean threat, according to some scholars, some international relations and defense scholars, is just a proxy for China, right? And if China, as has been indicated by some strategists, some observers and experts, is going to intervene militarily against Taiwan, Japan will inevitably have to follow the US intervention in defense of the island, right? So we don't really have I have much time to, and I don't have the evidence to make stable and sure predictions. But, you know, it will depend on how rapidly the international situation surrounding Japan will change, I guess. And, you know, governments, maybe more conservative governments in the near future, will have to take fierce and more radical decisions in this sense.
Hey, thank you. So
thank you very much.
Professor Hayakawa, I see you have a raised hand, so please.
Thank you very much. I am now teaching at the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Kyushu, but originally from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, taking 2-year academic leave. Thank you very much, Dr. Marco Zappa, for your excellent presentation reviewing the history behind the Japanese nuclear policy. I'm wondering how you define overcoming the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Having heard from, having listened to your presentation, I had a feeling that by overcoming the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you seems to be focusing on the attempt by politicians to review the previous nuclear policy of Japan. But the nuclear sharing idea presented by the late Prime Minister Abe is one thing, and boosting defense spending up to 2% of GDP, maybe in 2025, is completely another thing. So I'm interested in how you define overcoming the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in that respect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question and your observation also earlier in the chat, Professor Hayakawa. How do I define that? I saw a connection actually on the fact that, you know, there is an ongoing discussion about reviewing nuclear policy, long-standing nuclear policies, also in terms of military issues, as the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo raised a few months ago. And there is concomitantly an ongoing debate on raising defense capabilities of Japan. So I don't necessarily thinking that, I'm not necessarily thinking that these two will converge, these two debates will converge in just one, but isn't there the possibility? So this is my doubt. And already mentioning that, already thinking of acquiring preemptive strike capabilities is in a way overcoming the legacy of World War II and revisiting, reinterpreting Japan's role in the international community, in the international society, within the international society, as a peace-loving, as a non-militaristic power and nation state. So I define the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the epitome of Japan's, let's say, World War II story, right? And it's and the tragic and dramatic end of its also of its imperialistic enterprise. So overcoming also that trauma and that episode in history might serve to build, you know, the new Japan. Again, the late Prime Minister Abe intended to build and to rebuild by overcoming this post-war regime he often mentioned in his speeches and talks, especially. Yeah, probably I should have defined it more clearly, and I might you know, investigate more in that direction to provide a better definition and you know, to trace boundaries in a better way. Approaching this kind of issue, however, you know, was revealing of the fact that probably the World War II legacy, we are now at the time in history where the World War II legacy is gradually fading away, and Japan, especially under, you know, Prime Minister Abe, has aimed at building itself not just as an economic power as it used to be maybe in the 90s and as it used to be since the 1970s and 1980s and then 1990s, but enhancing its role, also its military role in the international stage. Probably this also relates and is tied to the long-standing ambition of Japanese policymakers to promote and to support a revision of the UN Security Council. But again, in an international situation where where an international power as Russia is threatening to use nuclear weapons, probably the desire to normalize Japan's nuclear posture, also in terms of nuclear deterrence, is on the table, is an hypothesis that might be explored, and again might be explored with the agency of more conservative sectors within the majority party, within the LDP. Let's say on a more positive note, in recent days, in recent weeks, it has been noted, and I think I don't exactly remember where, but it has reemerged that, for example, the People's Republic of China will not, again, deny the fact that it will ever use nuclear weapons against, in case of conflict, let's say. So this kind of declaration might be a positive or a more optimistic piece of evidence and sign towards, the future perspectives of the international and global affairs in the Asia Pacific. But again, having Russia basically at your door and the world's first nuclear power might lead Japan to, the direction of nuclear deterrence. So thereby overcoming, the legacy of being the only country in the world being bombed, being hit by 2 nuclear bombs. This is basically the reckoning I made while preparing this talk. But of course, it has to be developed in a more detailed and in a better way, I guess, in a more convincing way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question.
I see another raised hand. So, Riti Nalwa, please. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I will congratulate the speaker for taking up such a challenging topic to deal with. Now, my question is that the notion of anti-militarism nationalism is so deeply embedded at different levels in the psyche of Japanese people. For example, it is deeply embedded as a norm of anti-militarism. It is deeply embedded as a peace constitution. And there is a kind of a difference between peace constitution and anti-militarism. And at the second level, I will say how the threat of North Korea is a justification for a nuclear deterrence for Japan to take up, because Japan has already invested a lot of money acquiring anti-ballistic defense system. So how far is anti-ballistic defense system can basically justify for Japan to take up this, to become a nuclear power? And 2, I think the issue of Russia and Ukraine, the area is absolutely separated from East Asia. The Northeast Asian security architectures basically involves North Korea, South Korea, China, and Japan. What can be the extreme instigation? There has to be an extreme instigation for Japan to take up the nuclear deterrence. And I don't think so North Korean threat is as big a danger to Japan to basically overturn its posture. Because I think the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is still deeply embedded. So I find little bit of more justification has to be in your hypothesis to say that the Liberal Democratic Party or the right-wing nationalism or nationalists are trying to overturn the nuclear posture of Japan. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the interesting and actually thought-provoking question, and thank you also for this feedback of yours in which stimulates me to rethink and maybe critically analyze my own hypothesis and my own theories. What can be said? I agree with you that an extreme instigation needs to be there to radically change Japanese nuclear posture. I'm not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow. Again, it's something that probably needs to be analyzed and put in a medium to long-term perspective, maybe in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years even. But the situation is changing very, very rapidly. And, Japanese diplomats and policymakers, I guess, are facing, have been facing since probably the election of Donald Trump, quite an unpredictable and unstable landscape, right? And they have to they had to adjust pretty quickly each time, and they will have to adjust pretty quickly to new challenges arising from again the Northeast Asia and within the context of Northeast Asian international relations and defense architecture and security architecture. I'm sorry. So the rationale for this, however, might be the fact that especially with regards to North Korea, as far as I know, as I can understand, and as I the development of ballistic missile capabilities and capacities by Pyongyang is somehow connected to the fact that those missiles can actually move and can be vectors for nuclear weapons. So Japan, in a way, has to respond to that threat. I'm not saying that, again, I agree with you. This North Korean nuclear threat or missile threat is not enough to radically change the Japanese attitude, historically built attitude towards anti-militarism, anti-nuclearism, and so on and so forth. But however, let me rephrase this. In 2017 and 2018, actually, the Japanese government implemented a series of initiatives such as the J Alert, which actually contributed to building the perception of a serious threat. And I think much has to be done also in terms of research with regards to not much how actual the threats are, but how perceived those threats are. And I really look forward to to new developments in this strain of research and comments maybe from colleagues that are more expert than me in this sense. So based on a slightly or radically changed perception, I argue that the Japanese, that a more Japanese conservative government, a more conservative Japanese government, a more right-wing leaning Japanese government might, based on this perception of the change of perception, of the change of narrative, change its long-standing policies. So to me, at least, it's not how actual the threat really is, but how perceived the threat will be and is now. So according to recent studies, actually, we're now seeing an evolution in Japanese public opinion regarding anti-militarism and the value of a 100% pacifist constitution. The support for the pacifist constitution has been eroded gradually in the last few years. And it's now 50% against 50%. So it's probably not as ingrained in the Japanese psyche or in the Japanese attitude and the Japanese way of thinking of the world around them as it used to be probably a few decades ago. This is because 30 years of economic slowdown, of sluggish economic growth, disenchantment with the possibilities of continuous high rate economic growth and the equal distribution of wealth, a more nationalistic kind of public education. You can mention many factors that have contributed to this change of attitude towards the pacifist constitution. Again, this is something that, at least personally, I believe has to be preserved because it has been a very rare and beautiful exception in the international landscape. But I guess many leaders within the Japanese political arena are not of the same idea, are not of the same opinion. So they will fight and they will strive to make Japan more normal. This is not, again, just domestic pressures from within Japan, but of course you have a very powerful ally, the United States, that has been for years and for decades pushing Japan towards a more autonomous and independent defense posture. So I think somehow, these factors all combined might also lead to, in the worst case scenario again, and maybe, in 10 to 20 years, to Japan adopting nuclear deterrence itself and becoming more disenfranchised from the US nuclear umbrella. I hope I was able to answer your question, Preeti.
Yes, thank you very much. But I still have a few more questions for you.
Few doubts.
I wonder if we have time for that. I don't know, maybe I can email it to you, or maybe we can have,
sure.
I can just put it on chat.
Yeah.
Let's have a conversation. Thank you.
If you don't mind, maybe we can take the question from Matteo Dian, and then if there is time, another question for you, if you don't mind, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Marco. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. Just a question, a bit of the political scientist in me here, or IR theories, would ask whether the story that you want to make, the explanation that you want to give, is more something that goes from inside to out, working on the evolution of Japanese identity, and therefore saying, is the reworking of Japanese norms and pacifist identities that leads to a more active foreign and security policy, and therefore even to thinking about overcoming norms on nuclear weapons, or the other way around, or is a more foreign policy driven explanation that says the international environment is changing, the rise of China and North Korea then will lead Japan to overcome pacifism, because that basically is an issue of national security, and therefore Japan changes within because the external forces are determining change. So I mean, probably it would be easier to say out, I mean, immediately, what is the main driver for you, even if of course in reality things are more complicated and they overlap and so on and so forth. But I guess there will be a sense of direction that you could give. So in saying what is the main driver for you, in one case and the other, I would have a suggestion. If your story is a foreign policy story, a lot of this is about the perception of the credibility of the United States. Because it's easier to not to think about nuclear weapons if you believe that the nuclear umbrella of the United States is solid. And this has been the case in the Cold War, and then you can sort of take that explanation and then see whether it works or not. You mentioned Okinawa and nuclear weapons stored there and all that part. Otherwise, if there's a sense of reworking Japanese identity, I wonder if two things can be included. One is the fact that pacifist forces have been in decline. What Stockwin used to call the endbreak of the system. So the Japanese Socialist Party, and with the decline of the Japanese Socialist Party, you have also the decline of those voices that argued for neutrality and pacifism, but also the substantial sort of demise of the alternative after 2012. So the 3 years of the DPJ, the experiment, especially Atoyama arguing for a more balanced foreign policy between China and the United States, and basically the failure of that. So maybe those things are very important. And the other thing that I will mention, to be honest, is Abe and his criticism of the post-war regime. Because it's not like the entire Japan moving in one direction. There is a clearly sort of alternative on the right that comes out and says, all this pacifism, we have to rethink it, we have to criticize it, and especially we have to move past that. And with a particular historical judgment of that period. And so we kind of move out of it, and we find another role in the region and the world, essentially. But aside from that, thank you very much. I found it super interesting.
Thank you, Matteo, for your comments. As always, very precious to me and very insightful as well. I guess my story is more of a, inside out one, as I tried to put it in this presentation. Of course, the foreign policy aspects are involved in this and can be discussed in detail. And as you said, probably much has to do with U.S. credibility in the area and the U.S. credibility vis-a-vis, Japan. But I probably am more interested in, seeing how domestic forces in Japan, from within Japan, are trying to reshape, norms and Japanese own international identity, which is quite an interesting story since since the start of post-war Japan, right? Because it has been all about changing the country's identity from imperial power to responsible aid, international aid power, an economic power, 100% pacifist. So again, I think we're close and closer to another paradigm shift of this this sense of this of historical, I guess, importance, because of what is happening around Japan. Of course, so foreign policy again is in the story, but my interests, especially, you know, being able to analyze, you know, the language that has been used, and then it is used in the political arena in Japan, probably leads me towards a more careful investigation what is happening in the domestic field. So, you know, in the evolution of the debate and in the, you know, attempt to overcome the post-war regime that Abe, you know, very much dear to Abe. So yes, I agree with you that much as to, you know, in doing this, we should also consider how, you know, pacifist forces or more liberal forces in the political arena have lost their I think I have lost a little bit of you know, pull, of pull and of traction, and they're not considered a viable alternative to the LDP. I think probably the LDP within itself as a better opposition to, you know, other sides, other fractions of the LDP. So again, it would be, you know, again, probably it would be a matter of who wins, who gets more votes from within the party, and which faction actually goes to power in the end. But still, you know, even Kishida has had with I'm sorry, has had among his ministers Abe Shinzo's biological brother, Kishinobuo, who is, you know, quite a strong national. Well, yeah, it has many points in common with his late brother, especially with regards to, you know, enhancing the defense posture, enhance the security posture of the country. So it's always a matter of, you know, balancing probably the many souls of the LDP. And this might also, you know, lead to some kind of paradoxical outcomes, you know, when you have a more at least as it is described by also conservatives and right-wing newspapers, by a more China-friendly foreign minister right now. So many factors, I guess, can be considered, but my story would be more of an inside-out one. So the attempt to change Japan identity and the norms it has been followed for many years now. Thank you very much for the comments.
Thank you. So let me read two comments that we had in the chat. One is from Ram as an excellent idea, Marco. I will recommend Japan's relations with North Korea and the recalibration of risk. And also then Professor Hayakawa, who points out that revising the constitution is one thing and revising Article 9 is another. Revising Article 9 is much harder than revising the constitution in general, and the Japanese public is less willing on revising Article 9. And I agreed with Matteo that the credibility of US nuclear umbrella is one of the key issues. Yes, well, I will, again, like I'm very familiar with the debate about the reform of the Constitution and the interpretation of Article 9, but this is not my thing. I guess we have time for another very quick question. I see Preeti has left the room, so if there anybody else would like to ask a quick question or give a short comment, I think we can pick another one. Yes, Professor Hayakawa, please.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity again. I'd like to go back to nuclear sharing, which was proposed by the then late Prime Minister Abe. I think nuclear sharing is not politically feasible in many respects, personally speaking. For one thing, the US government doesn't seem to be in favor of nuclear sharing at all. And in case of former West Germany, I think nuclear sharing took place partly because of the West German public a distrust of nuclear umbrella by the United States. So in order to ensure the nuclear deterrence, I think West Germany felt obligated to go ahead with nuclear sharing. And so in case of Japanese context, I don't think the US government will support the idea of nuclear sharing. And from the local government's viewpoint, I doubt if there's any local government in Japan which would welcome nuclear base in Japan. And even if Japan doesn't have a control on the nuclear weapons located in Japan, I think that could be the easy target by potential enemy. And I don't think there's any mayors or governors who are willing to risk the lives of the people to receive the nuclear sharing ideas. And also, if I specify my comment on revising the Japanese constitution, I think you're quite right that there has been an increasing Japanese public who are willing to revise the Japanese constitution. And that has been reflected by Kometo's position, which has been becoming more and more flexible on revising the constitution. But even former Prime Minister Abe, his proposal was to not to completely amend Article 9, but just to add the reference to the self-defense forces as a legitimate institution. And so of course, that may not be legally compatible with the remaining clauses of Article 9, but still that proposal seems to be quite modest. But as you know well, since the Japanese constitution has been interpreted in such a flexible way that there is no practical need to revise the constitution. But the constitution makes a big difference in that it has set very rigid constraint on the Japanese self-defense forces capacity on the ground, and also joining actual combat like Iraq War, the Gulf War or Iraq War is not possible even with or without the constitutional changes. That is I think, a reflection of Japanese public strong, I think, commitment. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hayakawa, for these comments. Yeah, I fully agree with you about the issue of constitutional revision. Basically, all the flexible approach that have been established in recent years have kind of changed and erased the necessity to radically, revise the constitution, because the constitution is de facto already been, overwhelmed maybe, and kind of surpassed in practice. So I think, not much will change with the public recognition of the G8I in the constitution in the coming years, I guess. So that I'm wondering, about the actual experience of combat based upon, the 2015 reforms, and the fact that, Japanese self-defense forces might be also deployed in gray zones, right? And but the debate about how a gray zone is defined is still there and has to be kind of tackled in several ways, right? So yeah, just to say that you know, to thank you again for the comments, because they're very on point, and I will look into more detail in these issues you raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So it's time to close our very rich discussion. I feel a bit bad for Marco Zappa, because when we invited him to this talk, we said like, don't worry, it's just a very introductory talk to an audience mostly composed by, you know, STEM scientists. And then somehow we gather some of the world leading experts of this area of research, which at the same time makes me extremely happy about the success of this talk, because it went way beyond our expectations about like audience participation, the level of debate. So please join me in thanking again so much Marco for his kind of ability and to give us this talk. Thank you very much, Marco.
Thank you, Giorgio, and thanks for all the comments and insights. Very useful and wonderful. Thank you for inviting me again to Marco Pellegrini.
Mr. Secretary, would you like to close the session?
Me? Well, as I think you said exactly. So I really appreciate. I really tried my best to follow everything. So I guess I will have a one-to-one talk with Marco Zappa, so I can ask you all of my questions that I think that were not up to this level. So I didn't mention that I am a nuclear engineer, so I was very interested from the perspective of the bomb itself, and you really covered something that I didn't really imagine. So, but it was very really good to hear that. So I really thank you again, and also really thank you to everybody that participated. And again, the last thing, we are really welcoming to start this kind of collaboration with all of you. So please get in contact, in particular with Professor Colombo, but also with me if you want. And this is the last meeting, the AIRJ talk of 2022, but as Professor Colombo said, we are already planning for next year, so you will hear from us very soon. I wish you all a great evening and a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.